You've written it 1,000 times, on tax forms, on school applications, on the back of photographs, on envelopes you mailed to people you loved. Maybe you've even rehearsed spelling it out loud, slowly, for someone who got it wrong. Your last name. You've carried it your entire life. It's so familiar that it stopped meaning anything to you a long time ago. It's just a label, just a string of letters that separates you from the other John or Maria or Thomas in the room. But here's what nobody told you. That name, the one you've been writing without thinking since you were 6 years old, isn't just a label. It's a military record. Music. Historians at the University of Göttingen spent over a decade cross-referencing more than 400,000 German family surnames against imperial regimental rolls, church records, and administrative documents from the Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that dominated Central Europe from the year 962 to 1806. 800 years of emperors, wars, sieges, crusades, and religious schisms. What they found changed how genealogists look at German surnames. Certain names didn't emerge from geography. They didn't come from a village or a trade, they came from a battlefield rank, from a military function, from a position inside the most complex political and military machine medieval Europe ever produced. And most of the families who carry those names today have absolutely no idea. Music. Today we are going through 10 rare German surnames that reveal your ancestor fought, built, guarded, or commanded inside the Holy Roman Empire. Not 10 common names, 10 specific names, rare enough that if yours is on this list, the probability that it traces to imperial military service is significant. I need you to stay until number 1. Because number 1 belongs to a military religious order so disciplined, so feared, and so precisely organized that their tactical formations are still analyzed at military academies in Germany and Poland today. The name they left behind is still carried by families across Europe and the Americas, and almost none of them know what it means. But before we get there, I want to tell you something about number 7. Because number 7 is the name that surprised me most when I first came across it in the archival research. It sounds completely ordinary. It sounds like something you'd see on a mailbox in a suburb. And that ordinariness is exactly what makes it extraordinary. Because what that name once described was anything but ordinary. It was a position so dangerous that the men who held it were explicitly exempted from certain imperial taxes as compensation for the risk they accepted. Stay for number 7. Music now. I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, surnames change, records get lost. How can a name from 800 years ago still mean anything about my family today? That's a fair question, and the answer is more concrete than you might expect. In the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire, hereditary surnames became legally standardized in most regions between 1200 and 1300. Before that, surnames were often descriptive. They described what a man did, where he lived, or what rank he held. After they became hereditary, those descriptions froze in place. A family whose ancestor was a fortress watchman kept the word for watchman as their name. A family whose ancestor commanded cavalry kept the cavalry designation. Generation after generation, 500 years, 700 years, right up to today. The name is a photograph. It captured one moment, one man, one function, one position in the imperial machinery, and it never let go. Music. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere in your past, not a myth, not a story your grandmother made up, but a documented historical reality, there may be a man whose entire identity, whose legal standing, whose place in society was defined by what he did for the empire. He didn't know he was leaving you a clue. He was just doing his job, standing a post, forging a weapon, building a wall, riding into a battle he might not come home from, and then he signed a document somewhere. Or a clerk wrote his name into a regimental roll, or a priest recorded his family in a parish book, and the name survived. It survived the 30 Years' War, which killed an estimated 8 million people between 1618 and 1648, roughly 1/3 of the entire population of the German territories. That's not a statistic. That's a catastrophe on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine. Entire villages emptied. Entire family lines ended. The names that came through that period didn't survive by accident. They survived because the families who carried them were resilient enough, adaptable enough, or strategically positioned enough to outlast the worst conflict in German history before the 20th century. Your name came through that. Music. Let me introduce you to a man, call him Heinrich. We don't know his exact name, but we know men like him existed by the thousands in the imperial territories of the late 1500s. Heinrich didn't own land, he wasn't nobility, but he was something the empire needed desperately, skilled, disciplined, and willing. He trained for years to master a profession that most men in his village couldn't afford to enter. The equipment alone cost more than a peasant farmer would earn in 3 years. He accepted a rank, he accepted a function, and when the imperial summons came, and it always came, he answered it. The name of what he did became the name of his family. His grandchildren carried it, his great-grandchildren carried it, and somewhere down that line, maybe after an ocean crossing, maybe after a border change, maybe after a spelling got softened by a clerk who didn't speak German well, that name ended up with you. Don't skip past that. Let it sit for a moment. Music. Here is how this video works. We are counting down from 10 to 1. Each name gets the full story. Where the word comes from, what the military or imperial function was, what historical events it connects to, and what it means if your family carries it today. The names range from cavalry designations to fortress engineering titles to positions inside the most feared military religious order in medieval European history. Some of these names are rare enough that finding one in your family tree is nearly definitive evidence of imperial service. Others are common enough that the connection is probable rather than certain, but the history attached to them is no less remarkable. At the end, after number 1, I'm going to give you one concrete step you can take this week. No subscription service required, no expensive DNA kit, to start tracing whether your surname connects to any of the imperial records we're discussing today. German archival databases have digitized more than 60 million documents from the Holy Roman Empire period, and many of them are freely searchable online. I'll tell you exactly where to look, but that comes at the end. Stay for it. Music. One final thing before we begin. Some of these names are going to sound familiar. You may even know someone with one of them. You might have one yourself. And when you hear your name, or a name close to your name, I want you to resist the instinct to immediately say, "That's not me. My family is from somewhere else. It doesn't apply." Because here's what 800 years of migration, colonization, and spelling variation actually produced. A surname that started in a regimental role in Saxony in 1410 might appear today as 3 different spellings across Germany, Poland, and the United States, and all 3 branches traced to the same man. The name changed. The origin didn't. Keep that in mind as we go through the list. Music. 10 surnames. 10 corridors leading back through Reformation fire, fortress walls, cavalry charges, and the monastic battlefields of orders that shaped the German world for centuries. Your name is not decoration, it is evidence. Let's find out what it's evidence of. Starting with number 10. Music. Number 10, writer. Say it out loud. Writer. It sounds clean, almost elegant, like a family name you'd see on a brass plate outside a law office in Munich, or stitched into the lining of a coat that's been passed down 3 generations. But in the archives of the Holy Roman Empire, that name meant something specific, something military, something that cost money, required years of training, and put a man directly into the most lethal cavalry engagements of the 16th and 17th centuries. Reiter comes from the Middle High German reiten, to ride. But in the imperial military context, it wasn't a casual description of a man who owned a horse. It was a formal classification. The Reiter were the Reitersoldaten, professional pistol cavalry, heavily armed mounted soldiers who emerged as a distinct military class in the German territories during the 1500s. They wore half-plate armor. They carried wheel-lock pistols, weapons that in 1550 cost the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's annual wage. They rode horses bred specifically for military use, animals that themselves cost more than most commoners earned in 2 years. To be a Reiter was to occupy a precise social position. You were not a peasant. You could not be. The equipment cost alone made that impossible. But you were not nobility either. You were something the Holy Roman Empire created out of military necessity, a professional military middle class, men who existed specifically to fight and whose entire economic identity was built around that function. Music writer regiments served throughout the 30 Years' War, the conflict that ran from 1618 to 1648 and consumed Central Europe with a violence that modern historians still struggle to fully quantify. 8 million dead, entire provinces depopulated. The town of Magdeburg, a city of 25,000 people, reduced to rubble and ash in a single day in May of 1631, when Imperial forces under Field Marshal Tilly stormed its walls and killed roughly 20,000 of its inhabitants. The writer were present at engagements like that, not always on the winning side, not always on the side history remembers well, but present, documented, named in regimental rolls that survive today in archives in Vienna, Dresden, and Munich. If your name is Reiter, or Reuter, Ritter in certain regional variants, or Rither in anglicized American forms, your bloodline carried a military rank. Not a metaphor, a rank. A classification that placed your ancestor in the mounted professional forces of an empire that stretched from the North Sea to the Adriatic. That is what you've been writing on, forms your entire life. Music number 9. Wächter. Here is something that most people don't understand about medieval and early modern European warfare. The battle was rarely the hardest part. The hardest part, the part that determined whether a town survived or died, was the night before the battle, and the week before that, and the month before that. The constant, grinding, sleepless work of watching, listening, deciding who came through the gate and who didn't. Wächter means watchman, guardian. From the old High German Wachen, to keep vigil, to stay awake when every part of your body is demanding that you sleep. In the fortified towns of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in the imperial free cities, the self-governing urban centers that answered directly to the emperor rather than to a regional lord, the Wächter held a position that was simultaneously civic and military. He controlled the town gates, he managed the wall watches, he decided in the hours after dark, when no honest man should be moving through the streets, who was allowed to pass and who was turned back. In times of siege, and sieges were constant throughout the 30 Years' War and the earlier Hussite wars of the 1420s and 30s, the Wächter was often the most critical man in the entire defensive structure. Not because of his weapons, because of his judgment. Music picture a town in Thuringia in 1632. Imperial forces have been moving through the region for weeks. Refugees are arriving at the gates daily, families with children, carts loaded with whatever they managed to carry, stories of villages burned 3 days' walk to the east. The Wächter has to make decisions, every hour, every night. Is that man at the gate a refugee or a scout? Is that group of travelers what they claim to be, or are they advance intelligence for an army that will be here by morning? One wrong decision and the town dies. In many imperial free cities, the position of Wächter became hereditary, passed from father to son across generations. Because the families who held it had proven something that couldn't be taught in a month or a year, they had proven that their judgment could be trusted when the stakes were absolute. If your name is Wächter, or Wachter, Wachter, or Watcher in anglicized variants, your bloodline held the keys to a gate that an entire town's survival depended on. Not metaphorically, literally. Music number 8. Büchner. In 1438, a Bohemian military commander named Jan Žižka defeated a force of imperial cavalry at the Battle of Witkov Hill, using a defensive formation that relied heavily on something most European armies were still treating as an experiment. Firearms, early handheld firearms, crude, slow to load, dangerously unreliable in wet weather, were already changing European warfare by the mid-1500s. But in the German territories of the Holy Roman Empire, the men who truly mastered these weapons became a category unto themselves. Büchner comes from Büchse, the gun, the firearm, specifically the early hand cannons and arquebus weapons that were transforming battlefield dynamics across the continent. A Büchner was either a gunsmith, a craftsman who built and maintained these weapons, or, in many military records, the soldier who specialized in their use. Either way, the name marked a man who had a relationship with firearms that most people around him simply didn't have. Loading a wheel-lock firearm in the 1500s required a sequence of more than 30 distinct steps. In combat, under pressure, with opposing cavalry potentially 40 seconds away, men who could do that reliably, under those conditions, were not ordinary soldiers. They were specialists. And specialists in the Holy Roman Empire, a political structure fragmented into more than 300 competing territories, all of them constantly recruiting military talent, were paid accordingly. Music, the Büchsenschützen, the gun shooters, the firearm specialists, were frequently mercenaries. Their loyalty followed their contracts rather than their birthplace, because the market for their skill was large enough that they could afford to choose. This is documented in Imperial military payroll records from the late 1500s, where Büchsenschützen appear at pay rates 2 to 3 times higher than ordinary infantry. They moved between employers. They negotiated. In a world where most soldiers served because they had no other options, the Büchner had options. If your name is Büchner, or Buchner, Buchner, or Bixner in regional and anglicized variants, your bloodline carried a skill so specialized that it made loyalty negotiable. Your ancestors were hired for what they could do, not for where they were born, not for who they swore allegiance to, for what their hands knew. Music, pause on that for a moment. In a society built almost entirely on inherited status, where what your father was determined what you were allowed to become, the Büchner families occupied a rare position. They had leverage. They had something that princes needed badly enough to pay for. That's not a small thing. That's not a name you write on forms without thinking. That's a history. Music number 7, Scharfrichter. The word Scharfrichter sounds, to a modern ear, almost administrative, almost bureaucratic. It has the rhythm of a job title, something you'd file paperwork under. What it actually describes is one of the most psychologically demanding and socially complex positions in the entire imperial legal and military system. Scharf, sharp. Richter, judge. The sharp judge, the one who executed the judgment. The Scharfrichter was the imperial executioner. But that description understates the role by a significant margin. In the Holy Roman Empire's legal structure, formalized under the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532, the empire's first standardized criminal code, the Scharfrichter was not simply a man who carried out sentences. He was a legal officer. He was present at interrogations. He applied judicial torture under precisely defined legal protocols. He was required to understand anatomy well enough to calibrate pain without causing accidental death. He was required to execute sentences in forms ranging from beheading to breaking on the wheel to hanging, each prescribed by the court for specific categories of offense. Music. And here is what made the families who held this position remarkable. They were considered socially unclean by the communities they protected. They were excluded from guilds. Their children often couldn't marry outside families of the same profession. They lived at the edge of towns, in houses separated from ordinary citizens. And yet they were legally essential. They were paid directly by imperial or municipal authorities. They were explicitly exempted from certain imperial taxes in recognition of the social burden they carried. The Scharfrichter families of the Holy Roman Empire formed a hereditary professional caste, isolated, stigmatized, and absolutely indispensable. If your name is Scharfrichter or carries its regional variants Scharfenberg or Richter in combination with occupational indicators in archival records, your bloodline held a position that the empire could not function without and refused to fully accept into normal society. They served the system. The system never fully let them in. Music number 6, Luther. In the autumn of 1517, a monk and theology professor named Martin Luther nailed a document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. 95 theses, 95 arguments against the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences, certificates that promised buyers a reduced sentence in purgatory in exchange for money paid to Rome. Luther didn't think he was starting a war. He was wrong. Within 3 years, his ideas had spread across the German territories faster than the Catholic Church could respond. Within 30 years, the Holy Roman Empire was divided along a religious fault line that ran directly through families, towns, and military alliances. Within 100 years, that fault line became the underlying cause of the most destructive conflict in German history before the 20th century. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, 8 million dead, and the families named Luther were standing directly on that fault line. Music. The surname Luther has two possible origins, and historians still debate which branch of a given family descends from which. The first is geographical. There are towns named Luther in Lower Saxony. Luther am Barenberg is the most significant, the site of a major imperial victory in 1626, where Danish forces under King Christian IV were defeated by Catholic League troops under Johann von Tilly. Families from this region carried the town's name as their own, as was standard practice across the German territories. The second origin is more explosive. Luther, in certain regional phonetic patterns of the 15th and 16th centuries, appears as an early variant of Luther. Not necessarily a direct family connection to Martin Luther himself, but a phonetic association concentrated in precisely the regions where Lutheran Protestantism took hold most powerfully after 1517. Whether the connection is geographic or phonetic, the historical weight is the same. Families named Luther in the 16th century lived in territories where a single question determined everything: Catholic or Protestant. The answer to that question decided whether your children could inherit your property, whether your town would be protected by imperial forces or targeted by them, whether your priest would be allowed to conduct services or dragged out and replaced, whether, in the worst years of the 30 Years' War, soldiers would march through your village and leave it standing, or burn it to the ground on their way to the next objective. Music. Think about what that actually felt like, not as history, as a life. You wake up one morning and the theological position of your family, a position your grandfather held, that your father held, that you were raised to hold, has become a military liability. The armies moving through your region don't care about your crops. They don't care about your children. They care about which side of a religious argument you're on. And your name, the name you were born with, the name you can't change, is associated, however loosely, with the man who started the argument. If your name is Luther, your bloodline lived through a religious schism that didn't just split a church, it split a continent. And they survived it. Music number 5. Steinmetz. Every war in history has a logistics problem. You can recruit soldiers, you can train them, you can arm them and feed them and march them across 300 miles of contested territory. But when you get to the enemy's walls, when you finally arrive at the fortified city or the castle or the garrison town that your entire campaign was designed to capture, you need something that no amount of infantry recruitment can substitute for. You need men who understand stone. Steinmetz, stone cutter, stone mason. From Stein, stone, and Metz, derived from the old High German messen, to measure, to cut with precision. In the military architecture of the Holy Roman Empire, the Steinmetz occupied a position that was simultaneously a craft and a strategic asset. The fortifications that protected imperial cities, the walls, the towers, the bastions, the gate structures, were not built once and left standing forever. They required constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, and constant adaptation as siege technology evolved. When the cannon arrived in European warfare in the 14th and 15th centuries, it didn't just change how armies attacked cities. It made most existing city walls obsolete overnight. Music. The walls that had protected towns for 200 years, thick, tall, vertical stone barriers designed to stop scaling ladders and battering rams, crumbled under sustained cannon fire in days, sometimes hours. The response was the Trace Italienne, the Italian-designed star-shaped fortification system that spread through European military architecture in the 15th and 16th centuries. Lower walls, angled bastions, earthwork reinforcements that absorbed cannon fire instead of shattering under it. Building these new fortifications required Steinmetz families who understood both the old techniques and the new geometries. Men who could calculate load-bearing tolerances. Men who could work with the specific stone types available in different regions of the empire. Limestone in the south, sandstone in the central territories, granite in the north, and understand how each material would perform under sustained bombardment. Imperial free cities competed for these men. In the municipal records of Nuremberg, Frankfurt, and Augsburg, three of the most significant imperial free cities of the 15th and 16th centuries, Steinmetz families appear repeatedly in contract documents, paid at rates significantly above ordinary construction workers, and sometimes granted citizenship privileges unavailable to other immigrant craftsmen, because the city needed their hands more than it needed almost anything else. Music. If your name is Steinmetz, or its anglicized variants Steinmetz, Steinmetz, or simply Stone in families that translated the name after emigrating, your bloodline carried a skill that determined whether a city stood or fell. Not the soldiers on the walls, the men who built the walls. Music number 4. Bergman. There is a moment in the history of every medieval fortress when the question stops being about the walls. The walls are up, the towers are standing, the gates are reinforced. The question becomes, who do you trust to hold it? Bergman. Castleman. From Berg, castle, fortified settlement, and man. But in the specific legal and military vocabulary of the Holy Roman Empire, a Bergman was not simply any man who worked in or around a castle. He was a man who had made a formal contractual commitment to defend a specific fortification. The Bergman system was a formalized military obligation that appears in imperial records as early as the 12th century. A lord or an imperial city would contract with a group of men, sometimes knights, sometimes wealthy commoners, sometimes ministerials, the unfree administrators who occupied the strange social middle ground between serfs and nobility, to garrison a specific castle or fortified position. These men received a salary, sometimes land, sometimes housing within the fortification itself. In exchange, they committed to be present, to be ready, to hold the position regardless of what came at the walls. Music. The Bergman families of the Holy Roman Empire were the professional garrisons of the imperial defensive network. They weren't mercenaries in the modern sense. They weren't simply for hire to whoever paid the highest rate. Their obligation was to a specific place, a specific wall, a specific gate. This distinction matters. In the chaos of the 30 Years' War, when loyalties shifted constantly and mercenary armies changed employers between campaigns, the Bergman obligation created something rare, a man whose military identity was tied to a location rather than a paycheck. He wasn't defending an abstract political cause. He was defending his home, his livelihood, the walls he had contracted to protect with his own body if necessary. Bergman families appear in castle garrison records across Saxony, Thuringia, Hesse, and the Rhine territories throughout the 13th through 17th centuries. Many of these records survive today in regional archives and have been partially digitized through the Archive Portal D, Germany's federated digital archive network, which currently holds searchable records from more than 30 German state archives. If your name is Bergman, or Bergman, Borgman in regional variants, your bloodline made a contract. Not with an army, not with an empire, with a specific piece of ground. And they held it. Music, don't move past that too quickly. In a world where most people had no agency, where what you did, where you lived, and who you answered to was determined entirely by the circumstances of your birth, the Bergman families had made a choice. They chose a wall, and they stood behind it. Music number 3. Kurfürst, 7 men. For most of the Holy Roman Empire's 800-year history, 7 men held the future of the empire in their hands. 7 Kurfürsten, prince-electors, the men whose exclusive legal right it was, formalized under the Goldene Bulle, the Golden Bull of 1356, one of the most significant constitutional documents in medieval European history, to elect the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Kur from the Old High German Kur, choice, election. First, prince, the choosing prince, the electing lord. These were not minor nobles attending a ceremony. The Kurfürsten of the Holy Roman Empire were sovereign rulers in their own right. The Elector of Saxony controlled a territory larger than modern-day Switzerland. The Elector of Brandenburg governed a domain that would eventually become the core of the Prussian state and later the unified German Empire of 1871. The Elector of the Palatinate commanded the Rhine territories that controlled some of the most economically vital river trade routes in Central Europe. Each maintained his own army, his own courts, his own currency. his own diplomatic relationships with foreign powers. Music, when families carried Kurfürst as a surname rather than simply as a title, genealogical records indicate they were typically connected to the administrative and military apparatus that operated directly within an electoral court. Not the Kurfürst himself, but the men around him, the military commanders who answered only to the elector, the diplomatic representatives who negotiated on his behalf with other imperial powers, the administrative officials who managed the machinery of a territory that was, in practical terms, a sovereign state operating within the larger structure of the empire. The 30 Years' War was fought substantially over a single question that the Kurfürsten controlled: which religion would be permitted within each electoral territory. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose territory, his religion. The ruler decides the faith of his people. That principle made the 7 electoral courts the most contested political real estate in Central Europe for 100 years. The families who served within those courts, who carried the association of the Kurfürst in their surnames, were not bystanders to that contest. They were inside it. Music, if your name is Kurfürst, or Kurfürst, Churfürst in historical spelling variants, your bloodline moved through the corridors of the highest political and military power the Holy Roman Empire produced, one level below the crown, at the center of every decision that shaped Central Europe for 300 years. Music number 2. Festungsbauer. In the summer of 1529, the Ottoman army of Suleiman the Magnificent arrived at the walls of Vienna. 120,000 soldiers, 300 cannon, the most powerful military force in the world at that moment, at the gates of the city that served as the eastern anchor of the Holy Roman Empire. Vienna held, not because of the soldiers on the walls, not because of the cavalry waiting inside the gates, not because of the prayers offered in every church in the city on the night the Ottoman vanguard made its first assault. Vienna held because of the walls themselves, because 40 years before the Ottoman army arrived, a family of military engineers had rebuilt those walls. They had replaced the old vertical stone barriers that cannon fire would have reduced to rubble in 72 hours, with a new system of angled bastions, earthwork reinforcements, and overlapping fields of fire that the Ottoman artillery could not efficiently destroy. The men who built those walls had a name: Festungsbauer, fortress builder. From Festung, fortress, and Bauer, builder, one who constructs. Music, military engineering in the Holy Roman Empire evolved faster between 1500 and 1650 than in any comparable period in European history. The reason was cannon. When reliable artillery became standard in European warfare during the late 1400s, it didn't just change how armies attacked fortifications. It created an entirely new professional discipline: the science of building fortifications that could survive artillery bombardment. The Trace Italienne, the star-shaped fortification system developed by Italian engineers in the early 1500s and rapidly adopted across the empire, required a level of mathematical and geometric precision that traditional stonemasons simply didn't possess. Calculating the angles of a bastion so that no point on the wall sat in a blind spot, determining the depth and composition of earthwork layers to absorb cannon fire rather than shatter under it, designing drainage systems for fortifications in different soil types so that the earthworks didn't collapse in heavy rain. This was not craft, this was engineering in the modern sense of the word. Music, the Festungsbauer families who mastered this discipline were retained at extraordinary expense by imperial free cities and territorial princes across the empire. Municipal records from Ingolstadt, the Bavarian fortress city that became one of the most heavily fortified positions in the empire during the 16th century, contain payment records for engineering families who supervised the construction of its star-shaped outer defenses. Those defenses were tested repeatedly during the 30 Years' War. Ingolstadt never fell. The fortifications at Würzburg, at Ehrenbreitstein on the Rhine, at Königstein in Saxony, all of them retain construction elements attributed in archival records to engineering families whose expertise was so valued that they moved between imperial employers under contracts that specified not just their pay, but the conditions under which they could be recruited away by competing powers. They were protected assets. In at least 3 documented cases from the 1620s and 30s, opposing military commanders issued specific orders to capture, not kill, engineering specialists attached to enemy garrisons, because what those men knew was worth more alive than what their elimination was worth dead. Music. If your name is Festungsbauer, or carries Bauer in combination with fortress or military construction associations in archival records, or appears in regional variants such as Festner or Baumeister in military engineering contexts, your bloodline carried knowledge that determined the outcome of sieges before a single shot was fired. Not through courage, through mathematics, through the precise calculation of angles and earth and stone that kept cities standing when everything around them was burning. Pause on that. A man in your family line, generations back, in a century you've never thought about, sat down with a compass and a sheet of calculations and designed something that outlasted every army that attacked it. That knowledge became your name. Music, and now, number 1, music. I want you to imagine something. You are 22 years old. You come from a minor noble family in the German territories, not wealthy enough to inherit significant land, not poor enough to be forced into ordinary labor. You have options. Not many, but some. And then a recruiter for the Teutonic Order arrives in your town. He doesn't offer you pay. He doesn't offer you land. He offers you something that almost no institution in medieval Europe could credibly offer: the most rigorous military training on the continent, a brotherhood of men who would follow you into any battle and die beside you without hesitation, and a cause that felt, to a young man in 1230, like the most important thing in the world. He offers you the cross and the sword simultaneously. You take the vow. You become an Ordensritter. Music Orden, order, the religious military order. Ritter, knight, the order knight. The formal designation for a full brother knight of the Teutonic Order, der Deutsche Orden, the Catholic military order founded in 1190 during the Crusades at the Siege of Acre. Unlike secular knights who served a lord in exchange for land or payment, the Ordensritter took permanent monastic vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. He surrendered personal wealth entirely. He surrendered the possibility of marriage and family inheritance. He surrendered, in the most literal sense available to a medieval man, his individual life. In exchange, he received something that no secular institution could provide: total belonging, total purpose, total military brotherhood. Music, the Teutonic Order's military campaigns in the Baltic, the conquest of the pagan Prussian territories between 1230 and 1283, were among the most systematic and sustained military operations of the medieval period. Not raids, not seasonal campaigns. A 53-year continuous military operation that ended with the establishment of a monastic state, the Ordensstaat, covering the territories that would eventually become the Duchy of Prussia, the Kingdom of Prussia, and ultimately the core of the German Empire that unified under Prussian leadership in 1871. Follow that line: the German Empire that existed from 1871 to 1918, the Empire of Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm, the empire whose collapse led directly to the conditions that produced the 20th century's catastrophes. That empire grew from a territorial foundation that the Teutonic Order built with sword and cross between 1230 and 1283. The Ordensritter didn't know they were building Germany. They thought they were building the kingdom of God. Music, families who carried Ordensritter as a surname, or its variants Ritter in combination with order associations, Deutschritter, Kreuzritter in certain regional records, were typically descended not from the knights themselves, who by their vows could not produce legitimate heirs, but from the administrative and military support structure that surrounded the order. The lay brothers who handled logistics. The secular knights who fought alongside the order under contract without taking monastic vows. The administrative officials who managed the order's vast territorial holdings in Prussia, Livonia, and the German territories. These men had families. Their families carried the association, and that association survived everything. It survived the order's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where Polish-Lithuanian forces under King Władysław II Jagiełło destroyed the core of the Teutonic military strength in a single afternoon. It survived the secularization of the Prussian Ordensstaat in 1525, when Grandmaster Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach converted to Lutheranism and transformed the monastic state into a secular duchy. It survived the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic reorganization of German territories, 2 world wars, and a century of border changes that erased and redrew the map of Central Europe multiple times. If your name is Ordensritter, or carries this association in any of its surviving variants, your bloodline traces to the institution that military historians at the University of Warsaw, the Bundeswehr Command and Staff College in Hamburg, and West Point's Department of Military History still study today. Not as a historical curiosity, as a model of sustained military discipline and organizational coherence that has rarely been matched in the 800 years since. Your name is a military legacy, the most significant one on this list. Music 10 names. 10 corridors through 800 years of imperial history. Reiter, the professional cavalry soldier who paid for his own horse and armor and rode into the deadliest conflict in German history before the 20th century. Wächter, the watchman who held the keys to the gate when an entire town's survival depended on his judgment in the hours after dark. Büchner, the firearms specialist whose skill was so valuable that his loyalty was purchased rather than assumed, in an age when most men served because they had no choice. Scharfrichter, the imperial legal officer who served the system completely and was never fully accepted by the society he protected. Luther, the family who stood on the fault line of the Reformation and lived through a religious war that redrew the map of Central Europe for 300 years. Steinmetz, the stonecutter whose understanding of military architecture determined whether fortified cities stood or fell under sustained cannon fire. Bergmann, the garrison soldier who made a contract not with an army but with a specific wall and held it. Kurfürst, the family connected to the 7 men who elected emperors, whose courts were the contested center of imperial power for 3 centuries. Festungsbauer, the military engineer whose mathematics and stonework kept cities standing when everything outside the walls was burning. Ordensritter, the order knight whose institution conquered the Baltic, built the foundation of the Prussian state, and created a military legacy that war colleges still study today. Music, your name is not decoration. It is a compressed archive, a document written in the only ink that survives everything, the ink of survival itself. The men behind these names didn't know they were leaving you something. They were just doing what the empire asked of them, standing a post, cutting stone, riding into smoke and cannon fire, building walls, holding gates, and somehow, across 500 years of migration and war and border changes and ocean crossings and spelling variations and clerks who wrote things down wrong, the name came through, to you. Music, here is the one concrete step I promised you. Go to Archiveportal D, that's archiveportald.de, Germany's federated digital archive network. It provides free searchable access to records from more than 30 German state archives, including military rosters, parish records, and administrative documents from the imperial period. Search your surname. Try both the modern spelling and any variant spellings you know of. If your family emigrated, check Matricula Online at matricula-online.eu, which holds digitized Catholic parish records from German, Austrian, and Polish territories going back to the 1500s in some regions. You don't need a subscription. You don't need to pay anyone. The records are there. The name is there. Go find it. Music. Drop your surname in the comments. Tell me which number on this list connected to your family. Or tell me what you've always been told about where your name comes from. Write the number and the name, 1 through 10. I read every comment, and I'm building the next video partly from what comes through in the comments section. Surnames that people bring up that deserve their own deep investigation. If this video reached you, send it to one person you know who has German ancestry and has never looked into what their name actually means. 1 share. That person may be carrying 800 years of imperial military history and have no idea. Your 1 forward changes that. Music. Next week I'm going into a set of surnames that most people assume are ordinary German occupational names, the kind that appear in every family tree, the kind that genealogists usually pass over quickly. But I found a pattern in imperial administrative records from the 1500s that connects several of these names to a specific military reorganization order issued by Emperor Maximilian I in 1508, an order that restructured the entire imperial army and created new hereditary obligations for certain family lines that persisted for over a century. One of these names appears in more than 12,000 surviving imperial military documents, and the families who carry it today almost universally believe it means something completely different from what it actually meant in the context of that 1508 order. That video goes up next week. Don't miss it.